Good afternoon. My name is not Luis Rogul. Unfortunately, my camera is not working, so I'm using my colleague's Luis Rogul computer. My name is Alberto Garrido. I'm presenting this workshop, Acting Together for Net Zero, the role of research organizations. I'm a professor at UPM, and the goal of this seminar is first to present all the speakers, and there will be online presentations, and I'd like to introduce the speakers. So please, Astrid, Nicola, would you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Astrid Eichhorn. I'm a professor in theoretical physics at the University of Southern Denmark, and I'm the chair of the working group on climate sustainability in the academic system of the European Federation of Academies, and I'll be presenting their report later in the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, let me make an introduction of this seminar. On November the 3rd, CESAER, the European University Association, the International Sustainable Campus Network, Science Europe, the Network of Universities from Capital Cities, UNICA, and the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow, UK, organized a conference of the parties 27 leading the event on interdisciplinarity for net zero transition. This symposium came about following the call to action to research and higher education organizations for the net zero transitions launched at the COP-26 held in Glasgow in 2021. Following this successful event, the partners have produced a report to gather the key main highlights of the conference. Today's purpose is to present this report. In addition, the partners of the call to action value the act of working together and therefore are always seeking new partners and sister organizations who contribute to sustainability, which is why SELs and ALEA are here today. Our CESAER Task Force Sustainability is proud to have been following up on the call to action as a leadership of the task force. We hope this partnership will continue to grow and live on. Today, we are joining online Nicola Francesco Dotti, who is Senior Policy Officer for the Green and Digital Transitions of Science Europe, together with our own Advisor for Innovation and Sustainability, Luis Rogul, who is here with me. They have led the drafting of this report. We are also joined, as I said before at the beginning, by Astrid Eichhorn, who is a professor at the University of Southern Denmark and chair of the ALEA working group on climate sustainability in the academic system. Thank you, Astrid, and welcome again. And Martin Farley, who is founder and coordinator of the SELs network and responsible for the LEAF initiative at the University College of London in the UK. Thank you, Martin, and welcome. Thank you all very much for accepting the invitation to be with us today. I'd like to inform participants that they're all welcome to add questions via the chat. Following the presentations, there will be a 20-minute questions and answers section, and we will be picking up some audience questions to ask the speakers. So now, Nicola, Luis, I'd like you to start the webinar with the presentation and to introduce the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alberto. Let me start by sharing the PowerPoint. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thanks, Alberto, for the introduction. We will present the report, which comes from the event that together Science Europe, CESAER, UNICA, International Sustainable Campus Network, and University of Strathclyde co-organized back in November. And you see the title, Interdisciplinarity for the Net Zero Transition. We are happy to announce today the publication of the report, where we extracted the key messages from the event. We can share the link in the chat, and and now we want to share the key messages. And one of the key messages I can already introduce is acting together, which is the title of the report. But before entering to the key messages, a bit of information on the background, how we came together. This is a story that comes back to 8 November 2021, when at the COP-26 that took place in Glasgow, in the UK, we launched a call to action to research organizations and universities to act for the net zero transition. We all know the challenge caused by the climate change. It's a global challenge, and we came together, Science Europe, the Sustainable Campus Network, the University of Strathclyde, and CESAER, to act together, to work together. And with this call to action, we really wanted to be comprehensive. We know the net zero transition is a complex challenge. It affects many aspects, many dimensions, many challenges. And science, the scientific sector, wants to be in the lead and to contribute to this societal challenge. The call to action has been for us a way to have a platform to work together, because it's crystal clear to us that nobody can address it on its own. We have to be together. That's why this cooperation continue. In July 2022, we went to the ES of 2022 in Leiden, in the Netherlands, with a session on engaging researchers. At the last November, we presented a second symposium where we were joined by the European University Association and UNICA, the Association of University in Capitals of Europe, to take the first point of this call to action that I'm going to present a bit more in depth in the next slide, with the idea of putting forward the keyword interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity is relevant for both research and teaching activities, and we think that all disciplines should be mobilized to address the net zero transition. And then today, we are happy that we have also Alea and CELS to discuss how we can move together for this fundamental challenge. In this slide, you can see some of the key elements we extracted from the call to action. And as I say, we share a vision of a world where research and education communities work together. We need to mobilize all of us to find solutions, deepen our understanding, and tackle the climate crisis. To do so, we identified 6 thematic areas. The first one, as I mentioned, is interdisciplinary approach. All disciplines must be mobilized all together for this challenge. The second one is developing the next generation of students and researchers. We know that's it's a human challenge for all of us, and the next generation should be mobilized, and they already playing a fundamental role in this aspect. Third dimension is the reduction of our own organizational carbon footprint. Our organizations that have different structure, different way of working, we should all together lead by example. We should reduce our carbon footprint. We go from small offices that we have to the research infrastructure that are sometimes very large. So we have to play this role, and I know that Martin Farley will explain a bit more into this dimension after me. The fourth chapter is the engagement with policymakers, the policy, the actions that our governments at all levels, from national, European, international, but also local and regional, we need to have a dialogue with them to improve policymaking. Fifth, we have to improve our shared understanding. What are the challenges at stake? What is climate change? We have to deepen our understanding of the implications of these aspects. And last but not the least, I will never get bored in repeating that we have to act together. Science Europe alone cannot work for the net zero transition. We can really tackle this challenge only if we unite forces. That's why the call to action ends with the line that you see in the second column in my slide. We invite all research and higher education organizations and communities to work together. Today we have a small webinar. It's just 1 hour. Clearly, we won't solve all the problems, but the goal of today is really to convey the message of acting together and join forces for this challenge. Now, we want to share the 5 key messages we have extracted from our high-level event back in November. And for this, I give the floor to Louise Drogul.
Thanks a lot. My name is Louise Drogul. I'm advisor for innovation and sustainability at CESAER, who's one of the partners of the call to action. So the first key message from our report is about the importance of interdisciplinarity to tackle climate crisis. This was interdisciplinarity for the net zero transition was the theme of our symposium last year preceding COP-27. So it was clear that institutional leaders and all of the speakers present at this symposium, they really supported the importance and the crucial role of interdisciplinarity when it comes to research and teaching to promote the net zero transition. A lot of them explained that there are many interdisciplinary initiatives that already exist and that are really effectively tackling the climate crisis. But these clearly need to be scaled up to further accelerate the net zero transition. Furthermore, research stakeholders organizations, they should provide visibility of those good practices and examples to facilitate knowledge exchange, sharing of good practice, and support at the organizational level. So that's the first key message. And now, Nicola, if you want to do the second one.
Yes, the second one is leading by example. So in our work, we see that many university research funders and performers are already engaged in reducing their carbon footprint. There are more and more initiatives that are going on. We mapped, we found some of them. We know there are more ongoing, but this needs really to be scaled up to speed up the transition towards net zero. But we believe that leading by example is a way also to build the trust. We don't want just to, today we are presenting our report, but if you go on the websites of our organization, you will find many examples of the willingness to engage, to reduce, to lead by example. And this will be important to build trust among the actors to show that we are all together in this. So now I send back to Louise.
Thanks. So the third point was about involving students and next generation's researchers. Clearly, students, they're the leading force for the net zero transition. They are today's and tomorrow's leaders, professionals and experts of our world. So they need to be involved further in interdisciplinary teaching and research activities to bring positive changes to contribute to the net zero transition. And also by embedding the values of the UN SDGs they can really be the future agents of change towards climate sustainability.
The fourth key message is the importance for universities and research organizations to support the policy for the net zero transition. This is a very complex challenge. Solutions are not always easy to achieve, to implement. And here we're speaking not only about technological solutions, but really how to face the challenges, the legal, the political, the social, socioeconomic challenges to achieve the net zero transition. In the Paris Agreement, that's a big challenge. And we know there are many examples, many universities are engaged with local communities, and this has proven to be effective in their cities, in these regions, in the areas where they operate. This direct involvement is very important, and it aims to, again, mobilize interdisciplinary communities to achieve more holistic approaches.
And finally, last point, which is really the reason why we're here together, the reason why the partnership of the call to action has been going on for now 2 years. It's acting together. Both universities and research organizations, they're considered among the most neutral organizations. So they have a privileged position and mission to mobilize all other actors. They can bridge between the different levels, the different actors in society. The establishment of common platforms with research organizations, universities, but also business actors, citizens, governments, and any other societal stakeholders should be encouraged further to tackle global warming, the climate crisis, and net zero transition. Stakeholders' engagement should be at the international and local levels to really speed up the transition towards net zero, which is again why we're here today and why this partnership exists in the first place.
Okay, now some conclusions on the very briefly, also because I see time is running. The importance to mobilize research organization to develop also some guidance with concrete steps on what to do. Clearly, in these very few minutes, we couldn't elaborate too much, but that's where we need to go to concrete action and support the scale up of existing experiences. So I think that we can stop here, and I send back the ball to Alberto in Sweden.
Thank you so much. Let's move on with the agenda, and now I'd like to ask Astrid Eidhorn to give a presentation on ALEA's report towards climate sustainability of the academic system in Europe and beyond. So please, Astrid.
So I'm here to present the ALEA Working Group report on climate sustainability in the academic system. ALEA is the European Federation of Academies with member academies from about 40 countries. We published this report in May last year. You can find it online. I also just posted the link to the report in the chat. So the report really has 3 key messages that I will highlight. The first is that the academic system is currently not climate sustainable. And in the report, we provide concrete data to support that conclusion. The second key message is that individual stakeholders are now starting to take first steps towards climate sustainability. And in the report, we are highlighting some of the current practices. And the third key message is really quite positive in that there are many options of action which are available right now for all stakeholders to become more climate sustainable. And in our report, we provide an extensive list of recommendations. I, of course, invite you to take a more detailed look at the report and read it. It's somewhat long at about 100 pages, but we are providing a guide for the busy reader, which will hopefully allow you to quickly find what is most relevant for you. So let me now expand on those 3 key messages. And of course, the broader context of that is the academic system within the context of the climate crisis, where it is clear that academia is part of the solution because it provides relevant research, education of the next generation, and evidence-based policy advice. However, and this other aspect is usually not so much in focus, is that academia is also part of the problem through the emissions that it's creating by its own operations. And this is the focus of our report. Now we provide concrete data and examples to support that statement that academia is part of the problem. And I'll highlight some of them. And in order to interpret the data, we need a benchmark with which to compare it to. And in the report, we're taking the benchmark directly from the 2022 IPCC report, which estimates a quote unquote remaining carbon budget that was relevant at the time of that report. It's 300 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. That is a bit of an abstract number, but you can break it down to something very concrete, namely 1 ton per person per year until 2050. And that 1 ton is what we will be comparing data from the academic sector to. We don't, in the report, use this 1 ton as a very strict boundary. We use it more to provide an order of magnitude. So when we're comparing research activities and activities of the academic sector to that 1 ton, if you have something significantly above 1 ton, that's not very climate sustainable. If it's something significantly below, then that is more climate sustainable. So this is how you should think about that number. And now with this number in mind, we can now take a look at data from the various stakeholders. In our report, we are looking at all of the relevant stakeholders that together make up the academic system. Here, for reasons of time, I'll just highlight 3, which I think are most important for this audience. Let me get started immediately with universities. What I'm showing here is data from a sample of 25 European universities that cover different European countries, that also cover different sizes and different profiles in the universities. And you're seeing the greenhouse gas emissions per employee in tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So you can directly compare that number to this 1 ton up here, this benchmark, and you see the number of universities in that sample within a certain bin. The first thing to see is that basically all of them are above that 1 ton, some of them quite significantly so. So that's the first key message, doesn't look very climate sustainable. The second thing to note is that there is quite a bit of spread in this distribution here. And you could first think that that maybe has something to do with the profile of a university, how international it is, for instance. However, that's not the case. The spread mainly is because universities account for different aspects of their carbon budget. Some make up more incomplete climate reports and only account for scope 1 and 2 emissions. Those are based on heating, and those are the universities in light blue that tend to cluster at the lower end. And then some universities make up more complete climate reports, where they include scope 3 emissions, which include, for instance, emissions from travel, but also from the supply chain. And you can see that those tend to be significantly higher. And probably these more complete climate reports give us a fairer assessment of what typical emissions per employee at a university are. And you can see that this is significantly above this 1 ton per person. Now, moving on to research institutes, because they give us a more direct look at carbon emissions which come directly from research activities. So here's an example from astronomy, which is actually a discipline in which a significant amount of data on the climate impact has now been assembled. And there's a comparison here between Australia and a research institute in Germany, the CO2 equivalent emissions per researcher per year. You can see that the exact number, whether it's 42 or 18, doesn't matter so much. You can see that both of them are above this 1 ton, quite significantly so, actually. One of the key things to note here is that there is not just a significant contribution from travel, but in particular also a significant contribution coming from electricity use, and the majority of that, around about 90%, is actually from scientific computing. So here we have an example where a research activity is directly leading to quite significant CO2 equivalent emissions. A second example from particle physics, from the CERN environment report, shows a similar picture where the majority of the emissions is this dark blue column here, and that's actually emissions of certain fluor gases that come directly from the particle detectors. So a second example where it's a research activity that is directly having a significant climate impact. So let's now move on to funding organizations, because they play a very crucial role in setting the framework conditions in the academic system, and in encouraging or incentivizing or disincentivizing certain behaviors. So the first thing is that funding organizations in their own operations, of course, generate carbon emissions. For instance, that can already happen in the interview process for a grant. So here are data from the ERC, resulting in about 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions per interview, and only every second one of those is on average successful. So for in-person interviews, there's 2 tons of emissions, of CO2 equivalent emissions already before a grant has even started. And that brings us to a very significant data gap, because at the time of writing the report, we were not able to find a funding organization that reports the emissions from the funded research. And on the previous slide, I showed you that emissions from research can be quite significant. So this is really an important data gap here. So this data just highlights some examples that we collect in the report, but it supports this first key message that the academic system is currently not climate sustainable. So then what does it take for climate sustainability? We believe it requires a change in culture. And that actually means it requires a change in individual behaviors, but also in the larger framework conditions that determine the norms and incentives for these behaviors. And there are individual stakeholders which are now taking first steps towards climate sustainability, both in individual actions as well as in changing the framework conditions, norms, and incentives. To give you some examples, there are current practices which are in some sense easy to implement because they don't require a change of behavior. And so a top-down strategy can be successful. An example for that is installing green energy on campus. There is a second example for change that is currently happening that is more challenging because it requires behavioral change. And an example here is the developing of a travel policy that is currently happening or has already happened at many universities. Successful examples here are not necessarily those that implement a top-down strategy, but successful examples are those that involve everybody at a university in the decision-making process and in the development of the travel policy. And there are examples where such inclusive processes have resulted in travel policies that have already resulted in significant reduction of emissions from travel. And the third example is, I guess, also an example that we're experiencing right now. The pandemic has told us that a lot of our physical mobility can be substituted by virtual mobility, and for many events, for lots of exchange of knowledge, we can just get together virtually as we're doing right now. So now the next step, what is possible to do next? This is our third key message in the report. There is lots that all of the stakeholders can do right now to become more climate sustainable. And in our recommendations, the goal was not just to provide overarching principles and general guidelines, but to be very specific and provide specific actionable steps. And so if you read through the recommendations, you might find quite a few things where you would say these are quite obvious. And that's because in order to become more climate sustainable, we don't actually need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to implement those things that are actually obvious. So before I move on to the specific stakeholders, let me just highlight 3 recommendations for all stakeholders. An important one is to take a mix and match approach to meetings. So for instance, organizing conferences, don't be strict in whether every conference needs to be an in-person conference or a hybrid conference or an online conference. Think about what actually suits the goals of a given meeting best and take a mix and match approach. Think about whether it's possible to do some events hybrid, some events online, some events in person. More and more things will then happen in the form of virtual communication. And here's our second recommendation, that virtual communication needs to improve, both in terms of the technology as well as our skills, finding the unmute button on Zoom, but also in the formats that we use. So don't just take a traditional in-person conference and copy the schedule online, because online coffee breaks, we all know, don't work as well. So we need to actually make use of the opportunities that online tools provide to find better ways of connecting. And the third recommendation for all stakeholders is to base your actions on a solid evidence base, because otherwise you might be investing a lot of effort in reducing something that is just a tiny fraction of your actual carbon budget. But, and this is also crucial, don't just stop at developing that evidence base. So if a research organization publishes a climate report, it hasn't yet done anything to reduce its climate footprint. So acting on the conclusions of the climate report is absolutely critical. So to conclude, I will just briefly flash some selected examples of recommendations for all of the stakeholders here. You can find many more in our report, which I invite you to read. I will not go through these stakeholders one by one. I'll just flash them briefly and just pause here for 5 seconds so you can take a very brief look at those recommendations that are most relevant for you. So I'll stop for 5 seconds. All right, so I hope you took a quick look at the box that is most relevant for you. Let me highlight one recommendation for the individual academic. And that is consider all your opportunities for leverage. That is because the academic system is to a very large degree a self-determined system, much less influenced by policymakers than many other systems in society. In contrast, many individual academics in our roles as university presidents, as research group leaders, as presidents of academies, as referees in granting agencies, in all of these roles, we are actually determining the framework conditions of the system that we operate in. And that actually means many of us have a lot of opportunities for leverage. And in the report, we encourage everybody to use all of your opportunities. And so with that, I'll come to the summary and I'll just flash the 3 key messages again and stop here for now. Thank you for your attention.
Astrid, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very clear and the messages very well presented. So we really thank you so much for synthesizing such a valuable document and making the messages so clear and so encouraging and I would say provocative for all of us listening to you. So now let's move on to the next speaker, Martin Farley. He will present CEL's initiatives. So Martin, the floor is yours, please.
Hi, thanks for that. Greetings, folks. I work at University College London, and I've been working around sustainable science for a decade now, I've realized, which is longer than I would have thought. I'm going to do a short talk on the sustainability of science, introduce our networks, cells, and the LEAF initiative that I've been working on. So, actually, Astrid, our talks link very well, as you know, but we talk a lot about net zero, and we have, I wanted to mention at least UKRI's net zero strategy for 2040. But we have a lot of net zero targets, and how does this affect actually the sciences? Well, I'm not going to go through these, but I just wanted to highlight, what I work on is the sustainability of science, and science is very resource intensive. It is growing very fast, and altogether it is very emissions intensive. And so I know it enables us to better understand the climate crisis, but it also in some ways contributes to it. And in recognition of that, we wanted to talk about ways to mitigate this. Now, I think it's important, Astrid mentioned the scopes of carbon. I do think it's important to highlight this because when we talk about how to mitigate our impacts, we need to know where they are. And as you saw from Astrid's slides, is that, a lot of the impacts are in what we call scope 3. Scopes 1 and 2 are essentially our energy consumption. And most net zero targets that we talk about are focused on essentially net zero scopes 1 and 2. Scope 3 is the biggest source of our carbon emissions, and it is typically not included in our targets. And part of that is because it's very hard to quantify these things. When you purchase something, you don't actually know about the full impact of purchasing it. Now, I wanted to put on here, and this is the full estimates of carbon emissions from 2 universities. One is UCL, one is Copenhagen. And I've put this up because, I think it's interesting to see a university, there's a discrepancy between the two, and in part because the way we evaluate our scope 3 emissions is not the most accurate. We do it based off spend. And that, I'm not going to go into that now, but I still want you to walk away with this realizing that, the big impact is what we buy. At UCL, where I work, around half of our energy is going towards our sciences, and around half of our overall carbon emissions we think is going towards our sciences. It looks like it's around a quarter of that, albeit you could parse it differently at University of Copenhagen, but still we realize that science is a huge impact area. we had included our science facility buildings in ours, so it's again, different methodologies, but it's very impactful. Now, if we want to deal with just the purchasing side of it, I'm going to just give this as an example and then look at how networks and our programs can address this. So purchasing is this big area that consumes a huge amount of carbon, but the truth is we don't have good metrics or standards out there. You know, one of the common questions we have is, how do we buy sustainably? We don't know, to be honest. We really don't know. You know, companies are in charge of their own marketing material, their content, and et cetera, and it makes it very difficult. But in some ways that represents an opportunity for us to address this. Now, very quickly, I just wanted to give a practical example. I can't help but put this example on. This is a mouse cage, and it is a single-use mouse cage, and it is for the research sector, and it was marketed as more environmentally sustainable with this green label on it. And you know, it's a single-use mouse cage as opposed to a reusable one, and it's marketed that way because the suppliers are focused on you reducing your energy consumption. In other words, scopes 1 and 2. But of course, you produce a pile of plastic on the other end, and that is worse for the environment. And that's why we need to take into account the full carbon emissions of institutions and to understand the full impact of life cycle assessments. Now, very quickly, I'll just say, we did a life cycle assessment on reuse. People often ask, is it actually better to reuse? And yes, it is better. And we did this life cycle assessment essentially to provide the evidence that, yes, reuse is better. But we're getting a little bit too granular now. When we take a step back, we see that today we have good data on our institutions on travel, energy consumption, spend sometimes, and IT. We have current gaps in terms of our full understanding of the carbon of our institutions, in part, especially in the sciences, on consumables, so plastics, chemicals, and our equipment. And as we can see, is that this might be some of our biggest sources of our carbon emissions. You know, it's the consumption of materials. So we've started to do life cycle assessments to better understand the full impacts of science, but we still have some work to do. Now, I've tried to highlight that we need more research in this space. You know, we need to better understand the full impacts, and there are some aspects of the carbon, et cetera, that we don't fully understand. There's some aspects of science we don't understand. The science of science is, you know, sometimes not as well understood as we'd like it to be. You know, for example, storage temperatures. And actually, in the UK, at least, we saw that, you know, the Medical Research Council agreed, you know, we don't know how to do net zero science yet. And this was a grant that came out for £1 million last year that was essentially trying to understand how do we, enabling research. There was a really interesting talk I saw from Nick Watts, who's the doctor in charge of net zero, the greener NHS. So net zero, you know, NHS has this net zero target for 2040. And he came to UCL and he mentioned that if we implemented all of the actions that we know in the NHS, we might only get to 50 or 60% reduction in carbon emissions. So we need more enabling research out there. But on the timeline that we're on, we need action now. And you don't need me to tell you why, but we need to enable as much as we can. And for that reason, I think, you know, we see around Europe, there's all these initiatives that have been growing, and these are ones that are focused on the sustainability of science. I think the interesting ones here to point out are that we have national networks like Green Labs Netherlands, Green Labs Portugal, Green Labs Austria. We have our UK network. And essentially everybody's trying to address these issues in similar ways. And in recognition of that, we came together with all of these networks to produce something called CELS. You know, I went into the procurement example in a bit more detail because I think that really highlights the importance of something like CELS. Currently today, when people want to impact their biggest area of carbon emissions often of their purchasing, there is no good guidance. Some of the best guidance we have is from each other and from our case studies. And that a lot of time originates from our networks. And that's exactly why we need networks like CELS, essentially, is to bring people together in the absence of good metrics to address our biggest, our biggest area of emissions, really. So we've put together sort of this network of networks of sustainable science groups in an aim of providing networking events, training and resources, and et cetera, and to unify approaches. And to be honest, we're just getting started. You know, a lot of national networks are just getting started. CELS is just getting started, but it's something that we need to develop further. Now, beyond this, the other area that I work in quite actively is around, how do we actually mitigate this in the immediate? So, we can bring people together, but there's a lot more that we can do in the immediate to get those big chunks of reductions of carbon emissions. The analogy I love to give for this is that, sustainability today is voluntary. If you want to be sustainability, it's kind of up to you if you want to do it. You don't have to do it. And, when we wanted to make science safe, we didn't say to everybody, write your own standards, set your own target, and let us know how you get there. We've kind of done that with sustainability. And on the timeline that we're on, I'd argue that we need standards to make things quick, to advance more quickly. When we wanted to promote gender equality in the UK in the sciences, CS1 was mandated with research funding, and that helped change things. I would argue that today we need standards. The scientific community is really supportive of a lot of these measures, and they want to be engaged on how to mitigate their actions, that we see the impact of what we do. To help address this, I've been working on something called LEAF, and essentially this is a standard and sustainable lab operation. So essentially recognizing that people that work in specialist areas are seeking guidance similar to health and safety on what they can do now. And the idea too is to make it more accessible. People are busy, they don't have time to go and reinvent the wheel each time. So let's give them the content around actions they can take in these areas, including some on research quality. Because the more reproducible our research is, the better representation of the resources required to develop that data. LEAF is broken up bronze, silver, gold, user-led. I think that's important that we're not funded by manufacturers. We work with them, but we're not directed by them. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And we have calculators in the tool to estimate the carbon impacts in terms of carbon and money, because at the end of the day, when you do this stuff, you do save on money and you save on carbon overall. There might be a reshifting of budget sometimes to reinvest more into technical communities as opposed to suppliers, but that's a good thing too, because we invest in our local, as opposed to, yes. I'm not going to go through this, but the point is that we give guidance to labs on what they can do. And, people are seeking this guidance. It's practical stuff that aligns with good science and good lab practice. So why not make it accessible today? LEAF has grown, it's become the largest program of its kind, and probably one of the best things to mention is that the Medical Research Council has made it a stated target for its institutes to achieve gold by 2025, which is the first time I know of a funder setting an actual target around a sustainability program for the sciences in the world, which is amazing. I can't tell you how happy I was about that, really, honestly, that was amazing. So we've been working with funders in this space because, the point of LEAF in some ways was to give a metric for organizations like this. Because, years ago when I went to the Wellcome Trust, we said, why don't you have metrics in your grants around sustainability? And they came back with a really fair response was, we don't know what a sustainable lab looks like. How do we standardize it if we don't know what it looks like? So we've tried to produce this standard to fill that gap in some ways. So we produce guidance and resources out there to support this. And I mentioned the medical research at Join, but we've seen that it's spread across the world, really, and it's about to go in its 16th country. This was just an example from Copenhagen. So very quickly, I just want to say in doing LEAF, we've recognized that there's this gap in all types of specialist areas. We're building versions of LEAF now for computing and dry labs, for animal facilities, clinical labs, and the aim is to develop these so that, it is to help this whole population of folks that are high impact, specialist areas that want to be sustainable today. And I just thought I'd mention, I've seen across, some of the funders are really taking action around this, and we've seen, I mentioned MRC and Wellcome have taken some action around low carbon travel, but we've also seen the Green Charter, and I think Astrid mentioned this as well. And I couldn't help, I would put a slide similar to Astrid. I'm not going to read these out, but there's just some thoughts on things that funders could potentially do in the sector from what we've seen, and it's aspirational. But in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there, say thank you very much to the organizers for the slot today to speak, and for everybody for listening, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Martin, again, for being so specific, so clear, and for reporting on such wonderful initiatives that are taking off and that are offering ways for our universities, laboratories to be more sustainable. We have a few minutes for questions from the attendants. So, Nicola, would you want to raise some of the questions about the speeches that we hear? Any question that you might want to select from those from the audience?
I'm just reading from the chat, and there is
in the meantime.
Lars needs, so maybe we want to pick it up. And the question is, did any of the reports discuss stopping fossil fuel company funded sponsored events or phasing out fossil fuel research in general? Or discuss the divestment? I think this is really high on the. I will start answering from our point of view. I see this point is very high on the agenda. It's quite challenging. It's one of the greatest challenge because there are. I want to highlight the most positive elements. We moved from yes or no to climate change to those who want to move faster, to those that try to slow down the process, but it's now almost impossible to deny the impacts of climate change. In this respect, the disinvestment from the fossil fuel industry is one of the biggest challenge, and I know it's highly political and quite divisive. There are discussions at the highest level. So we follow the debate. I see a clear action are not yet taken by the highest level, at the political level.
Thank you, Nicola. Let me summarize a little bit some of the findings and the comments that were mentioned today. First of all, the importance of interdisciplinarity as shown in the first report and the call to action highlighted by Luis. Would you comment on this interdisciplinarity? Would you have any comment on this, Martin, Astrid?
Sure, I can maybe go ahead in that. When it comes to reducing the carbon footprint of academia, interdisciplinarity is of course critical because there are shared challenges, right, across all of the disciplines, and universities are interdisciplinary institutions. So a disciplinary approach will not get us very far. On the other hand, and I think this has also become clear in Martin's talk, there are a lot of carbon emissions that are tied to very specific research activities. And those then require disciplinary approaches. So what that overall means is that there needs to be a dialogue both within the disciplines, and that can happen, for instance, also at the level of national or international disciplinary societies, so that a whole discipline moves to setting new standards and thinking about how do we address the challenges specific to that discipline, whether it's a discipline that is high in scientific computing or lab use or whatever. But also there needs to be a dialogue at the interdisciplinary level so that really academia as a whole moves forward. So I think both of these aspects are crucial, and they need to both happen at the same time.
Martin, do you want to add anything on this, please?
Honestly, I think she said it really well, particularly the point about the focus in some science areas. I think you can come up with I think she said it best, honestly. I'm not going to add to that, actually.
All right. The importance of science policy was highlighted by Nicola. Is there any role, as you see, in terms of the programs and the government policies, European policies, with regards to science policy to make this more actionable, even to include some requirements from project proposals in terms of integrating some of these goals? Do you see actions from this in defining science policy?
Yeah, so I can get started. We have a section on policymakers in our report because they can, of course, play a crucial role. I would say the first crucial role is to enable more climate sustainable actions. For instance, and I don't believe that it's the case everywhere, that the procurement rules for universities are such that one can make the more climate sustainable choice over the more economically viable choice, right? So that is clearly something that policymakers need to address. I would like to, however, also emphasize that I think now is still a time when within the academic system, we can drive a self-determined change towards climate sustainability. I believe that in a few years from now, that window will change and there will be more strict rules from policymakers, and that might not be rules that in the academic system we are all happy with, because they might not be sort of very specifically targeted to academia. So I believe we now have a unique window where we can still become more climate sustainable on the terms that we as researchers or general people in academia, that we actually decide how to get there. And if we wait longer, then it might indeed be the policymakers that just force us to take a specific path that might not be the path to take. So I think that's a crucial thing to keep in mind when it comes to the involvement of policymakers.
Martin, there's a question in the chat, but you might want to comment on what can be done in order to unify the calculation methodologies of universities' emissions. Do you have any recommendation for a specific calculating methodology or calculators to use? Any comment on this?
In the immediate, what I would actually say is to come together to speak. So I put two examples on my slide. One was from UCL, one was from the University of Copenhagen. And when we saw the discrepancies in some of our figures, we contacted each other and said, you know, how did you calculate this? And the truth is that people do need to speak together, because there is no necessarily accepted way or supplier. Often it's a third-party supplier that's providing a service for institutions. So to be honest, I think that could be a role, though, or a place for wider organizational bodies across Europe, you know, is to say, actually, is to engage institutions about what tools they are using, and to do a survey and to assess, essentially come up with recommended tools and to outline what are the implications of using different tools. Because we've actually just undergone an exercise to reevaluate our Scope 3 evaluation tool at UCL, and it was very challenging, you know, and it was quite lonely, I have to say, in terms of a process, because we didn't know what other people were doing. We don't know if the one we pick is necessarily the correct one for the sector. But what we are going to try to do is to be more transparent about, you know, how we've come to that decision and what the implications are. Because as you can see, you know, we use different methodologies, and it creates different hotspots. And a lot of our community is scientists, and we want to know that our data is somewhat comparable and accurate. So I would start to say is start the conversations, and then bring together potentially organizations like your own to say, you know, let's do a review, look at what's out there and discuss what makes the most sense.
Thank you, Martin. Astrid, you mentioned the ALER report provides recommendations for the next steps to take. In a sense, you emphasize the importance of individual behavior as a vehicle for cultural change. And at the end of the day, it's up to every person in a laboratory, in a research institute, really to respond that. But the question is that enough? Does something more needed to happen to make the academic system climate sustainable? Could you comment on this?
Yes, thank you. So, of course, it's not enough just for individuals to take action. It's not even enough for individual organizations to take action, right? It really needs to be a cultural change across the academic system. And that actually means that we need a platform for a dialogue that brings all of the different stakeholders together, that brings together individual researchers, students, universities, academies, research institutes, and where we figure out where we as a whole academic system actually want to go to, and also what are the values underlying such a transition. What are the things that we prioritize? What are the things that we deprioritize, right? So that all of these things are really required and cannot happen just at the level of individual action. And so what is really needed is that academia as a whole starts a dialogue on how do we envision a climate sustainable academic system that hopefully we reach not just in a few decades, but within the next decade.
So Nicola, there are some green chemicals with various vendors, but they're very expensive. So what is the real response to that? What are the price differences that what does this represent for laboratories' costs for running experiments?
Yes, we know we need to know. We need to keep on monitoring. That's why we appreciate initiative like CESAER to raise awareness, to know which are the chemicals to be used and how we can deal with the difference in these prices. So we really need to address these aspects to get a mapping, to be informed what are the green chemicals, what really means green. So this, I think this reflection is ongoing, and it's good that we pay more and more attention so we can be aware and find solutions for the various needs.
Thank you, Nicola. I believe we should close this workshop. It was very, very interesting. It really raised many questions, and the information that was provided was very, very useful. I can announce that the presentations will be available to all the participants. And I thank you very much, Astrid and Martin, for making such a wonderful and synthetic view of what you're doing and the messages and recommendations that the different reports have produced. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And this is part of the call to action for the net zero transition, and it touches on a very, very important aspect related to science and technology, because we are operations as well. We run operations in doing research as well. I think with this, I'd like to close the seminar. Those that are present, the CESAER Task Force, we will resume in 30 minutes. So thank you so much, Martin, Nicola, and Astrid. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Luis, as well.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.